Tanith and Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt. One wonders what an Inquisitor of my station is doing delving into the history of a backwater world whose only claims to fame is their main export, wood, and no longer existing. Not to mention a commissar whose career summary up until this point could handily fit on the back of a milk carton. Besides one wanted poster, that is. But considering the aforementioned commissar's upcoming elevation, I suppose it is only appropriate to cover his and the Tanith's admittedly remarkable climb. Call it due diligence. So, Cadet Commissar Gaunt probably first arrived at the attention of War Master Sladeau during his time serving alongside the Hurricane 8th under the tutelage of Commissar General Delane Oktar. During his service with this regiment, he participated in the subjugation of several rebellious Imperial worlds, and most notably in the war against the Orcs that would gain Sladeau the fame he required to become War Master of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. It was also whilst fighting the Orcs that Gaunt's mentor, Commissar General Delane Oktar, died after having been, of all things, poisoned by green-skinned saboteurs. And it was with the Commissar General's dying breath that he elevated Gaunt to the position of a full commissar. A dramatic and striking story that Sladeau would almost certainly have heard of, but he had probably already heard of Cadet Commissar Gaunt from the same sources and reasons that the Inquisition first heard about the young Commissar Cadet, as he was part of a most fascinating incident on the world Darenda. The Hurricane 8th was one of several Imperial Guard regiments that had been dispatched to bring the world back into the light of the Imperium, after the foolish locals, probably under the influence of psychic cults, had decided to try and secede from the Imperium of Man. This obviously could not be allowed, and the Hurricanes, along with other Imperial Guard forces, were invested with significant powers to do whatever was required to bring the rebellious populace to its knees. However, it was of near equal import, for the Inquisition at least, to find out why this had happened in the first place, and so quite a few captives were taken, one of which was a female psyker. During her interrogation process, she requested to be allowed to speak to Cadet Commissar Ibram Gaunt, mentioning him by name. And as the Inquisition hadn't really had all that much progress with her, it was decided that it would be interesting to humor this request. The Cadet Commissar was brought to her, whereupon she had a psychic incident. Now, even the Inquisition's a little sketchy on what precisely occurred, but some sort of prophecy was imparted to Gaunt. A prophecy that would later on dictate and guide some of his actions. He had also apparently been told that the warp knows you, Ibram. Now, under any normal set of circumstances, a Commissar Cadet that comes into contact with a warp phenomenon like this would simply just be shot immediately, especially a Cadet Commissar. Someone who would, in the future, be responsible for the moral well-being of an entire Imperial Guard regiment. But, clearly, the protective Aquila of his mentor, Delane Oktar, kept Gaunt from a firing squad, and this decision was later justified by his actions, particularly against certain Inquisitors as well who had strayed from the light. But regardless of which incident it was that would eventually see him be noticed by War Master Sladeau, Gaunt ended up on a list of a little over 1,600 promising officers, commanders, specialists, etc. that Slido compiled personally as part of the crew that he wanted to bring with him on the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. At this point, Gaunt would have been a fully fledged commissar, still serving alongside the Hurricane 8th. The regiment would continue to serve admirably throughout the Crusade, but the culmination of their history up until that point, and the moment of greatest glory, came, of course, on Balhaut, when Gaunt, in de facto command of the regiment, led the charge at the Oligarchy gates, breaching and seizing them finally for the Imperium's advance into the Citadel. Which was not only a remarkable achievement, but a public one as well, caught on camera, if you will. Exactly the kind of event from which careers are made. And many expected Gaunt, having been one of Slido's favourites of course, to be immediately elevated to a high command position, a generalship, or perhaps for him even to be handed a marshal's baton to replace the peaked commissarial cap. It is of course quite rare for a commissar to become a commanding officer, but it is not unheard of. Instead, however, he was given a far rarer and more unusual reward, being elevated to the same strange dual title as his mentor, Delane Oktar, making Gaunt a Colonel-Commissar. A very rare beast indeed, and a thoroughly despicable one in this Inquisitor's not-so-humble opinion. The entire point of the commissarial system is to have men whose primary occupation is the moral well-being of a regiment who are outside of the command structure, so as to be able to act against it during times of moral decline. They are intended as a safety net. They are intended as a guard against corruption, and as a final bastion against that corruption, taking root and using a regiment, a significant Imperial military force, against the Imperium, usually via the rapid and determined application of a bolt round. Thus, a twin title of Colonel-Commissar completely and utterly defeats the entire point of having a commissar. Instead, you have now created a rogue element within the Imperial Guard, a regiment commanded by a man who technically, theoretically, is outside of, and in certain circumstances, above the chain of command. A recipe for disaster, in my opinion. And a recipe that was to be proven disastrous later on during the battle for the Vunhive, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. As another part of the Colonel-Commissar's reward for his heroic actions on Balhaut was the command of an Imperial Guard formation. Gaunt himself lobbied aggressively to be allowed to remain with the Hurricane 8th, or at the very least to be given command of another Hurricane formation. But the 8th were being withdrawn from the front line to be reconstituted and reformed, as it had taken severe casualties during the Balhaut operation. Now, theoretically, command of other Hurricane forces may have been on the table, were it not, of course, for the fact that the man who had so elevated Gaunt was now dead. Slido was no longer War Master. Makaroth was. And all the favour and privilege that Gaunt may have built up with the preceding War Master was not only non-existent with the new one, but probably the source of significant rancour as well. as Makaroth did not particularly like the old man's old guard, and was seeking to place his own mark on command by elevating his own officers. However, he couldn't simply dismiss Slado's wishes either. He had to honor them, if for no other reason than to keep the peace and appear as if his war mastership was a direct continuation of that of Slado, to grant him additional gravitas and legitimacy. So, a regiment needed to be found for Colonel-Commissar Gaunt, but as his star was not particularly elevated with the new War Master, it would not be an established regiment. He would instead be granted a, to be fair, relatively generous command of fresh troops, as there were many new regiments that were currently being raised all across the captured portions of the Sabbat Worlds. There were even, no doubt, new regiments being created in the wider Imperium, which would eventually flood into the Crusade as reinforcements and replacements. And after the victory of Balhaut, a fair few of those would have been rather prestigious. In another universe, Gaunt would probably have been given command over one of these. But now, however, there was not only his position as the old man's man to consider, but also the fact that Gaunt was not a particularly popular individual in Imperial Guard command circles or amongst Imperial nobility after his censure of the commander of the Jantine Patricians, Dershus. The Jantine Patricians were a noble regiment who had achieved great things, and its commander, Dershus too, was a man of significant renown. But Gaunt had managed to gather evidence suggesting, and proving clearly enough at least for a commissarial court, that Dershus had been the man responsible for the death of Gaunt's father. This crime would never have been discovered were it not for the Commissar's efforts. Efforts that only manifested after the thought of who was responsible for his parents' murder emerged in the Commissar's mind after his encounter with the secessionist Psyker. Again, it is a not inconsiderable miracle that Gaunt was not shot. But technically and legally, it was well within his right to issue censure to the commander of the Jantine Patricians. Censure that would in this case take the form of a field execution, which turned into a chainsword duel as Dershus was not willing to go quietly. But even if Gaunt had every right and every reason, that would not quell the cries of discontent from Imperial nobility, who viewed this as a slight against their honor and as a stain upon their reputation. Nor would it quiet Imperial commanders either, who viewed this as a borderline rogue action of a commissar from the Hyrcan 8th going over to the Jantine Patricians, a completely separate regiment, and executing their commander in the field during suppression operations against insurrectionists. No matter how justified, that is the action of a dangerously loose cannon. And so, whilst the War Master did, as mentioned, have to honor the wishes of his predecessor, he was entirely free to decide what manner of honor to bestow upon the Colonel-Commissar. And so he was placed in command of 3 regiments to be raised from Tanith, a tiny, insignificant backwater world on the outer edges of the Sabbat Worlds, whose only notable contribution to the Imperium preceding the Crusade was an export of wood and carving. feelings? Most, including Gaunt, saw this as the demotion it was very clearly intended to be. Though, to be fair, it was a relatively generous command of 3 regiments, the Tanith First, Second, and Third. A little over 6,000 men with supporting armor and artillery elements. Light, sure, but still it was a sizable command. And in theory, with future reinforcements and replacements, of course, a significant enough force to win Gaunt his world, as the 3rd reward promised to him by Slado was settlement rights over the first planet he truly conquered. Though that seemed like a very long-term and optimistic goal, as Gaunt's first impression of the Tanith was not a very good one. Descending from the transports now holding in stable orbit above the planet and its capital, Tanith Magna, Gaunt found a bit of a rabble. His 3 regiments were camped haphazardly in tents, scattered around with precious little regimental order outside of the walls of the capital. And the individual Imperial Guardsmen did not impress either. They were shaggy, lanky, soft-spoken woodsmen with pale skin, and no martial bearing to speak of. Nor did the disappointment end there. The Tanith appeared categorically incapable of maintaining near any semblance of either a uniform or a grooming standard. No doubt the Commissar would have been horrified to see thousands of hairy, bearded, unshaven guardsmen, most of whom were covered in tattoos. Their uniforms, too, were highly customized. Some had even gone so far as to tear off the sleeves of their combat fatigues. The only pieces of kit the Tanith appeared to have any respect for at all were their 3 signature pieces, the first being a large, curiously patterned camouflage cloak. The second were long, gleaming, silver-polished knives, which were also reflected in the regimental emblems. And lastly, their lasguns were luxuriously furnished with gnarlwood stocks and details. This latter part being the only real indication that the planet had taken any pride whatsoever in this founding. By most Imperial standards, the Tanith would at first glance be judged quite harshly indeed. Some sort of semi-savage backwater militia, recruited from local guard forces and PDF if you're lucky, and if that failed to bring about the required numbers, jails. Fun fact, there were actually a fair few criminals amongst the muster. The contrast to Gaunt's previous assignment, the Hyrkans, could hardly have been any more stark. The Hyrkan 8th were exquisitely drilled and disciplined assault infantry, the likes of which even the mighty Space Marines of the God Emperor's Adeptus Astartes would feel no shame fighting alongside, as they indeed had during the assault on the oligarchy. Next to their soldierly style, the cheerful amateurs of Tanith must have started to seem like quite the downgrade. And the Colonel-Commissar, was certainly starting to see it that way as well. He had initially been quite optimistic about his fresh regiment, but now pessimism had most certainly started to set in. Not feeling in the mood for extended ceremonies and endless self-congratulatory toasts, the Commissar gave the order to begin loading the troops onto transports and shipping them to orbit immediately. No parades, no inspections of the troops, just up and away as quickly as possible. Though even so, the Colonel-Commissar was expected to make an appearance at the formal dinner. Passing the time, he did at least look at the previous history of the world and his new regiment, though there wasn't a whole lot to be found. Tanith had been settled a very, very long time ago, either during humanity's initial journey out into the galaxy, or sometime preceding the Horus Heresy. Furthermore, supposedly, although with records this ancient, any clear heritage line is as much educated guesswork as it is myth, but supposedly the gene stock of Tanith heralded from the northern regions of Europe, and especially Albia. Now, interestingly, the Albians fought against the Emperor during the Unification War, and early on actually managed to fight his Thunder Warriors to a stalemate, where Albia was slowly being bled dry of warriors, but the Emperor too, not exactly overblessed with resources at the time, decided instead to try to pacify the, well, no longer islands, mountain chains, more like, after of course the Atlantic having had dried up completely, elected instead to seek a negotiated peace and alliance with the warriors of Albia, promising them a place amongst the stars in his campaign to retake the void in the name of humanity. The ancient warlords of Albia accepted this proposition, and whilst there is no clear evidence whatsoever that the Tanith descended from these people who ventured out into the galaxy from old Albia, considering their later military achievements, it is at the very least a possibility. Not that the Colonel-Commissar would have had access to records that ancient, mind you, as probably the most information he could have dug up on them were of their ancient dynasties, as Tanith was, during olden times, ruled by the Hohlweg dynasty, who must have ruled with a reasonable degree of fairness and goodness for quite some time for their name to survive for this long at all. But later on, as with so many dynasties, eventually the apple falls a little bit too far from the tree, and tyranny took over. This oppressive variant of the dynasty was eventually defeated. How exactly? Well, probably due to some sort of populist uprising, though Tanith law claims that the king was overthrown by the so-called Nalsheen, wood warriors wielding double-bladed staves tipped with long silver-edged blades. The same silver-edged blades that the Tanith now used as knives and used in their iconography. Sounds a little bit fanciful and far-fetched to me. The idea of a secret order of warrior monks protecting the downtrodden and the oppressed, but the galaxy certainly has seen weirder things. Although, if Tanith had ever had a super-secret society of warrior monk protectors, then they were either not enough or not around when Tanith needed it the most, as the world was about to suffer the consequences of choices and actions that it had no way of knowing of and no way of effecting. Millions and millions of miles away, Warmaster Makaroth's policy of aggressive consolidation was winning the Imperial Crusade tremendous amounts of territory into the Sabbat Worlds. The enemy's war hosts were in complete disarray, fleeing like scattered rats from the Imperial Crusaders. But some of those rats, fleeing from Balhaut, were now trapped behind the swiftly advancing Imperial lines, attempting to find any way to get out from behind the blockade, or simply fleeing south, north, or even westwards in the hope of finding either a chink in the Imperial armor or making a nuisance out of themselves. And one of these splinter fleets arrived at Tanith. Why? We do not know. It could have been pure simple coincidence, a fleeing fleet happening across an Imperial force, apparently loading something from some planet or other. They may have been heading towards Tanith on purpose, knowing that it was there and knowing that it was likely to be poorly defended, being on the periphery. Perhaps seeking plunder, or slaves, or replacement personnel to replace those of the crew lost in their battle with the Imperial Navy. Or maybe it was the warp trail of the Colonel-Commissar's flotilla, arriving in the system to pick up their own replacements that tipped them off. Or maybe darker reasons and portents still. Personally, I actually favor the latter explanation, because the Chaos War fleet that arrived in the Tanith system did so in a very unusual way. First and foremost, there was very little warning that the war fleet was approaching. It was able to disgorge its troops onto the surface of Tanith whilst the Commissar was still getting ready for dinner. The war fleet, furthermore, after carrying out a near flawless surprise attack, elected to not engage the Imperial fleet, gorging itself on the planet's fighting men and virtually hapless and defenseless against the marauding bands. Instead, the Chaos Forces decided to descend upon the world, upon Tanith Magna in particular, whilst scorching the rest of the planet via orbital bombardment. A strange thing in and of itself. Why would they elect to invade this world if they were intending to destroy it? Surely if they came here for slaves, then a mere 3 Imperial Guard regiments would not stop them, especially not if they had access to orbital bombardment capabilities. Nor were they apparently in any hurry either, as they were more than willing to sink down into low orbit to begin their attack, indicating very clearly that they found the Imperial ships to be no danger whatsoever, as a ship in low orbit carrying out bombardment is extraordinarily vulnerable. So clearly the Imperial force was nothing more than maybe a handful of very light escorts and transport ships. So there must have been something that the Chaos Forces thought they could find on the planet, valuable enough to commit to a ground invasion. And yet, there must also have been something about the world that they found particularly objectionable, to the point where they were willing to engage in orbital bombardment even with their own troops on the surface, and thus also denying themselves all of the world's resources and all of its slaves too. And then there's the fact that there even was an orbital bombardment at all. See, it's not every ship that's capable of rendering a planet uninhabitable. That either requires an absolutely enormous quantity of traditional lance firepower, usually poured into a world over the course of days, if not weeks, if not months, from a tremendous amount of ships, or the deployment of some sort of specialized weaponry, like virus bombs or planet crackers. Now, Tanith was a forest world, so one could argue that it would burn nicely, but it's also a forest world with sentient trees capable of shifting and moving. Surely that, if anything, would make it even more difficult to burn out completely, one would think. Not to mention again the simple fact that burning an entire planet to the point of it no longer being habitable would be an enormous undertaking, especially with just lance batteries and bombardment cannons, unless they had come specifically prepared to torch this planet in particular, perhaps with some sort of massive airburst napalm weaponry, aiming to create several enormous firestorms on the planet, capable of scorching out incredible quantities of forestry almost immediately, setting continent-sized fires. Now, one should always be careful about looking too deeply for reason and rationale in the actions of the arch-enemy, for their reasons are all too often their own and alien to decent, right-thinking Imperial minds. But this all seems as if it required a degree of coordination and interest that seems highly unlikely that one would find in just a random, scattered war fleet. But, of course, at the end of the day, the why matters not, only that it happened. The Chaos Forces descended upon the world of Tanith, which had precious little, if any, defenses with which to try and fend them off. It was not a heavily fortified world, it did not have anti-orbital batteries, and what fortifications it did possess were stone fortresses, designed to defend against rival clan leaders or rebelling peasants, not a billion tons of starship in space. And clearly there couldn't have been that much on the ground to discourage the raiders either, as they descended right on top of Tanith Magna, presumably via bulk landers, as the Colonel-Commissar was forced to flee from the palace whilst under attack by Chaos forces. Indeed, the Colonel-Commissar almost lost his life in the escape attempt, being saved by a Tanith child by the name of Bryn Milo. And just as an inquisitorial aside, it might be easy to assume that the Colonel-Commissar was the target of this raid, particularly if the forces had some sort of presight or omen of things to come. But if that is the case, I think they were probably there for the child, rather than the Colonel-Commissar. But hey, pure speculation. The defenders of Tanith Magna were swiftly overrun or destroyed from orbit, if there even were any real defenders to speak of, bearing in mind the planet had just carried out an Imperial founding, which would probably have stripped the cream of the PDF, if not indeed the majority of it, leaving nothing more but guard forces or policing units to resist the invading Chaos ground troops. Furthermore, a little over half of the 3 regiments, some 3,500 odd Imperial Guardsmen, had already been transported up into orbit due to the Colonel-Commissar's orders to begin the loading procedures immediately, leaving only a little over 2,000 Guardsmen left on the surface of Tanith. Once the Colonel-Commissar arrived, there were immediate calls for him to authorize the remainder of the regiments to return back down to their world, in an effort to try and stem the tide, or more likely to simply die alongside their planet. But the Colonel-Commissar famously refused this request and instead ordered the fleet elements to leave Tanith behind to burn and to die. The Colonel-Commissar made this decision because he already knew that if there were Chaos warfleets roaming this far behind Imperial lines, then clearly War Master Makaroth's bold gamble to consolidate via offensive means had left the Imperial forces dangerously overextended and stretched out. Even his seemingly relatively paltry force of a regiment and a half might be a valuable addition, as the War Master would need every single man. And even if he had decided to try and fight for Tanith, he would be deploying men via unarmored orbital landers from unarmored transport ships back down to the planet. It had already taken hours to get them up there, and it would take hours more to get them back down again, during which time the transport ships themselves would be virtually unguarded. Again, if the Chaos Warfleet was bold enough to enter bombardment orbit, there was not a whole lot of Imperial stuff in the skies to protect them. And even if there were enough to protect the ships themselves, the landers would be sitting ducks. Remember Balhaut, where the largest force under War Master Slado suffered something along the lines of 80% casualties merely transitioning to the planet's surface? Fighting for Tanith was quite simply not an option. Even if Gaunt had wished to do so, it would have been a futile gesture that would have thrown away his regiment for nothing. Less than nothing, as the only conceivable consequence of attempting to deploy the Tanith forces back down to the world would be their utter annihilation, and thus the consolidation of the Chaos Raiders' victory. A victory as the Imperial transports were leaving the burning world behind already seemed a certainty, as when 3 rank-and-file representatives of the Tanith regiments came to meet with the Colonel-Commissar, he was prepared to shoot them, as he was expecting the entire regiment to straight-up rebel, as they would obviously hate him for refusing to allow them to go to die with their world. Worse still, none of the officer corps had been salvaged. There was no command and control structure within the Tanith right now above a sergeant. And after being surprised by the fact that no immediate rebellion was forthcoming, Gaunt simply named the 3 representatives to be the regiment's new command cadre. Colm Corbeck would be given overall command, Elim Rawn would be placed as second in command as a major, and McCall would be given the title of Chief of Scouts. Why? Well, because they were the ones who confronted Gaunt. That's why. And so surely they must have some backbone, surely they must have some trust amongst the men, and they weren't shooting at him, so clearly they must have some remnant of loyalty as well. That latter assumption was to be proven somewhat incorrect very shortly thereafter, but for the time being at least, Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt had his regiment, the Tanith First and Only, and would try to lead them as best he could whilst fearing a dagger in his back at any moment. It would take all his skills as a leader and a commander to forge something effective and uniform out of this haphazard collection of different pieces of regiments without commanders, without the men who they had trained alongside with to lead them into battle. The only upside of it all was that the heavy equipment had mostly been loaded aboard the transport ships already, so at least the regiment was well furnished with small arms, with heavy bolters, mortars, and autocannons, although none of its armor and none of its field artillery, even light pieces like quad launchers, had been loaded onto the ships. So I am sure the Colonel-Commissar, hoping for at least an ounce of mercy, wished that the first deployment of the Tanith First and Only, their virgin battle, would at least be a light engagement, where they wouldn't miss that heavy equipment too much. But we all know better, don't we? Misery does so love company, and so the very first deployment orders the Tanith First and Only would receive was to the world Fortis Binary, where for the last 6 months Imperial Guard forces had been engaged in a grinding, artillery-battering trench war against the world's massed cultist insurrectionists. Nurgle insurrectionists. When it rains, it pours. And how the Tanith will come to do on Fortis Binary, well, that will probably be part of the next episode. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.